When the ball dropped on December 31, 2019, I remember being a total nerd and saying, "This is the year of vision." I was finishing a master's degree and I was 6 months into a new job. And on the other side of the world, there were rumblings about the coronavirus. I remembered Ebola at the time, and though it wreaked havoc in Africa, I didn't. I remember that it didn't really make it to the United States, so I thought the same would be true with COVID. Then, in March of 2020, I was with David Mohammed from the last episode, and Christopher Cook, my longtime creative partner. We were playtesting our Mechanics of Segregation game Shapes with a group of students from an Overland Park, Kansas high school just days before everything shut down. By January of this year, of 2021, Bellwether Education Partners and others were raising the alarm that there were an estimated 3 million students who had fallen through the cracks, unable to attend virtual school for one reason or another. Teachers were bringing their expertise in teaching while often having to simultaneously parent children of their own biology and having to be instant tech wizards with virtual learning. This fall, most districts are slated for in-person learning, but rising COVID rates in many states, including my own, cast doubt upon whether the dam will hold. I'm Nathaniel Bozarth. In today's episode, wide-ruled veteran Brian Dolezal discusses what he's seeing as the must-dos for educators in the aftermath of COVID, or at least going forward from this the previous stage of COVID. Here's our conversation. Assistant principal at Sumner Academy in KCK. And yeah, I'm excited to have you on again.
Glad to be back.
What I think as we start season 2, what I'm interested in hearing from you, Brian, I know you're very intentional about your work as an educator. You're an avid reader. I not only have I seen you posting about reading a lot, I know many other people who talk about how much you read. So I'm really interested, as someone who's really staying up to date and doing things, what are the big issues facing education right now that are the top of your mind in the fall of 2021? Crazy time.
Yeah. So, last year was certainly was survival mode. It's hard to even kind of keep track of the time sometimes. And, it's hard to believe that 2 years ago, when spring break hit, there was this talk about not having school for the remainder of the year, that they might shut down schools. And we were getting ready to go to Minnesota on a family vacation. I was like, there's no way, man. And then spring break hit, and
my wife canceled the vacation.
We did because everything was kind of shutting down, and then school shut down. And, I think everyone was kind of in awe at first. And then when we realized that we still got to educate kids, we still have a system to run. And we realized how ill prepared we were, and how much we depended upon, brick and mortar and physical interaction to serve students. So, that first half a year when we closed schools was really rough. And, that we called it kind of continuous learning. And there was lots of grace that was provided to students. And, my job as an administrator changed greatly during that time. It went from, I believe that the administrator's job is first and foremost to put teachers in a place to where they can best serve kids. But I found myself on the phone with families and parents more than ever before, because kids had stopped showing up. Kids weren't turning in work.
And this is kids that stopped showing up virtually on screen.
Right. Yeah. And lots of hotline calls, lots of trauma. And then we do almost an entire year up until I believe it was April of complete remote learning through Zoom. Right. And,
did you think when at that spring break moment where you canceled your plans, did you think that remote learning would not only be spring break to the end of the year, but then the whole next school year?
No, did not anticipate that by any means. And there were some things that we talked about to prepare, and it really, I think it opened up some avenues for education that we quite haven't thought. So, when you talk about coming out of a pandemic, as we have, I think some of the things that we realized in teaching kids through an online environment is the importance of one, trauma-informed instruction. And what I mean by that is I don't want to paint a picture that all kids are traumatized, right? But when you teach in a school or in a school system that serves a very diverse population, you have different scenarios with kids, right? Who don't have those safety nets, who don't have those parents who are helping them monitor their own learning, who are helping them keep their schedule. In some instances, we had kids and I had to take over a couple classes. We had some teachers resign mid-year, and we had some long-term subs, but, and getting those long-term subs, kind of into the system and how to do Zoom and Google Classroom, I had to take over some classes as an administrator and teach English. And, teaching to a bunch of black boxes was really hard because kids weren't required to turn their cameras on. So you're talking to a black screen versus being in front of, a classroom of 25 kids who are lively, and you almost wish for classroom management skills at some point.
You wished you had a class to manage with misbehavior or whatever.
Right. And, when kids did turn their cameras on, some of them had their siblings like resting and sleeping on their shoulders, right? And they were taking on responsibilities, and some kids were working, right? And they wouldn't show up for class, but they'd turn the work in, right? Wow. So I think, just that idea of that different kids have different circumstances. And there's a line there where you have to think about, like, fair isn't always equal, that whole argument of equity versus equality. Mm-hmm. Not all kids are starting from the same place, man. And I think we have to acknowledge that. And then I think, so this idea of trauma-informed instruction and kind of social emotional learning, right? Like how to manage emotions and impulses, self-management, self-control. And then the other one is culturally responsive teaching. And I know that critical race theory is a kind of a hot topic right now. And although I believe in the study of critical race theory, I kind of tend to lean more towards culturally responsive teaching, right? Which is a set of practices that make you more culturally aware as a teacher, mm-hmm. how your actions impact students on a regular basis.
So both of these things, trauma-informed teaching and culturally responsive teaching, how does it affect your classroom management style? Is it a matter of just getting trained so that your teachers, educators are interrogating their own bias? Like what does it look like kind of practically?
So I think that's the interesting part is sometimes in education and maybe in other realms, like, I've been an educator my entire career, but we look for the quick fixes, right? Like what's something I can do tomorrow that could make me a more trauma-informed or culturally relevant teacher? Those are quick fixes, and they may work in the moment, but they don't change the mindset, right? So I believe that being trauma-informed and being a culturally responsive teacher is a mindset shift. And it is a set of practices, but if you don't have the mindset that's right to implement those set of practices, then you're kind of going through the motions. You're either unconsciously competent or you're unconsciously incompetent, and you're doing more damage than good when you don't understand kind of the mindset behind and the research behind these practices. So when I say that, I think about what a culturally responsive teacher is, right? And what are the mindsets and the shifts in your thinking that has to happen when you become a more culturally responsive teacher? So first and foremost, I think you have to understand the socio-political context of which our kids are coming from. The second thing you need to understand are the cultural implications, right? Like the predominant culture in the classroom should not be the teacher. It should be the students in the classroom. And I think in too many instances, the predominant culture that's taught in the classroom is the teacher, not the students. Not in all cases, but
So unpack that. What do you mean by culture in this case?
so belief systems, actions, habits, right? Like when you walk past the classroom, culturally, is it a quiet, everyone's sitting in their seats, you raise your hand, versus it's a very active classroom where there's lots of movement, call and response.
Is it almost like the locus of control? Like is the like it almost or like the power structure?
Right. It is, right. And if you think about the shared power in a classroom where the norms of social behavior are shared and understood, and it's not the traditional hierarchy of teacher holds all the information, students sit down, teacher delivers information, students give information back to teacher, and that's the currency of education, right? Paulo Freire talked about that quite a bit in his book Pedagogy of the Oppressed. But going from that to where our kids are a wealth of knowledge, right? And like we can use their cultural experiences and their community experiences and their life experiences to really tap into what they already know and can do, and leverage that to teach new content.
So it sounds like it's a different way of teaching. Like it's more than just it's getting beyond a lecture style. It's getting beyond just worksheets. Is that right?
It is. It's so you have like surface level culture, and a lot of this is coming out of culturally responsive teaching in the brain, which is a book that I dug into with a few of my teacher friends over the summer while we were in pandemic. And that text is by Zaretta Hammond. And really, what she talks about when we think about culture is you kind of have surface culture, which is songs, holidays, music, the way we talk, and then you kind of have what she refers to as shallow culture, which is the nonverbal communication, the concepts of time, food sources, personal space. But then you have like deep culture, right? Which is decision making and concepts of self and worldview, and definitions of group identity, and spirituality, right? So I think that a lot of times we live on surface culture, what's observable, right? Maybe it's hair or language or food, and I think we've in education we've lived in surface culture for a long time, right? Because of Black History Month and Cinco de Mayo. But we rarely go into shallow and deep culture, right? Those collective and I would say almost unconscious beliefs and norms that happen in an educational system.
So is culturally responsive teaching like catching? Is it almost like catching? So if I'm a white teacher in a classroom of students that don't look like me, is culturally responsive teaching like trying to catch myself where I'm expecting them to have the same deep values as me? Is that?
No, I think it's understanding that we all have different values. All right. So, the third tenet I was going to talk about was relationships and the importance of the teacher-student relationship. And I think if you can remember back to your teachers doing those get to know you activities, like the 3 truths and a lie and all that stuff, right? Like We're going to spend the first 2 weeks of school getting to know each other. But I think that sometimes we underutilize that information. Like, I get to know you, right? Okay, everything's kumbaya. Then I put that to the side, and now I start teaching my content. No, like for me, culturally responsive teaching and knowing culture is I get to know my students, and I'm taking notes about my students. And then when I'm teaching new content, I know what students have connections to that because I've been listening to their stories. I've been listening to where they've come from, right? And I know them. I know what they like and dislike. I know whether they're shy or boisterous, right? And I'm able to leverage my knowledge of my students to deliver information that's going to stick, right? It's not much different than schema theory. And schema theory is an educational term to where, the brain's like a big file cabinet. And when new information comes to the brain, it floats around in there, right? And when it connects to something you already know, that's when it's filed into the schema, right? Your file cabinet. If it doesn't connect to anything that you know, then like the brain just lets it go because it's useless knowledge, right? Doesn't connect to anything I already have. So for me, knowing a student's culture and a student's background and developing a relationship with that student is using that knowledge to connect with them in a way, not only just to form a relationship with them, but also to help them understand the content and the skills that you're teaching.
It makes me think of, I think in the last time you were on the show, we talked about, so your roots are as an English teacher, right?
Yes.
And you said this last year you taught English incidentally as well. And I remember you talking about maybe teaching Shakespeare or something and how it didn't exactly connect to the students. Is there a way that you can take something that's like a classic or canon literature like that and connect it into someone's schema who, like, I'm not sure what in my schema that connects to. I don't remember getting much out of Shakespeare personally.
Yeah. And I think, Shakespeare would probably roll in his grave to know that the educational system decided to read his work versus watch it.
And I should say that I'm British. Like, I'm like 97% British in my ancestry too. So if anyone should be connected to it, I guess it should be me.
Yeah. But I also think too, I think you can. And, one of the things that I know is, when you start thinking about culturally responsive teaching, race does come into play, right? And you, as a teacher, you cannot go into conversations about race half-cocked. You've got to know how to navigate a space, not only with adults but with students, if you're going to engage in a conversation about race. And when we talk about the literature that we teach, and I've made so many missteps in my career around this. I'm very human, but when white teachers kind of stray away from that white canon, right, and we start teaching my more diverse literature, the underbelly of America starts coming to be, right? I think about Richard Wright and Native Son, right?
I read that for the first time last year.
Yeah. And, as a younger teacher, I was pretty courageous. I taught Jeffrey Canada, fist stick, knife gun. But, even having some teachers who've taught like Malcolm X autobiography, right? And when the N-word comes up, and as a white authority figure, do you use that word in front of students who are Black or who are Hispanic, right? And
my vote would be no.
Yeah, and you have to know how to navigate that, right? And when those contentious issues come up around race and equity, as a teacher, you have to be prepared for that, and know how to navigate that and not get on the defensive. Because the minute you get on the defensive, and I watch your work too, Nathaniel, and Beverly D'Angelo and White Fragility, and I saw that post around, should white people be making or exploiting critical race theory for profit? However, her ideas still stand true, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
that white fragility of, and I think Ibram Kendi says it too, right? Like to be called a racist is a deep moral blow to one's character. And no one, rarely will people say outwardly, I am a racist,
Right.
right? Um, so I think Ibram Kendi, I really appreciate his work in How to Be an Anti-Racist when he talks about there's no such thing as a non-racist. You're either a racist or you're an anti-racist, and it's a sliding scale. And it depends on the day and the actions that you take
Yeah.
as an educator that show you if you're anti-racist or racist.
Yeah, I think it's so much more helpful to think about individual actions and moments instead of the wholesale. Robin DiAngelo like talks about it in terms of the good bad binary. Like you're not just a
Right.
good person or a bad person; it's individual actions. And something that Kendi said that has really stuck with me. Um, he mentioned this in a talk that if someone comes up to me and calls me a racist, or says that something I did was racist, instead of me getting defensive about it, it's much better for me to treat it like I've gone to a doctor's office and been told that I have cancer, which hits home for Kendi because he had cancer. But like if my response to a diagnosis of cancer is one of outrage, like how could you say I have cancer, then I'm not going to get treatment and I'm not going to get better. But if instead I can have a certain solemnity to that, like, oh God, like I did something racist, help me get treatment, what can I do, how can I figure this out? It's a much better response. But
Yeah, and I would say that going to Sumner, I think probably the greatest learning experience in my career was coaching a slam poetry team. And
louder than a bomb.
Louder than a bomb, Kansas City, yeah. And Sumner had a good run. We had about 3 years there where 2 out of those 3 years we went to Brave New Voices in the Nationals, and competed against some of the best slam youth poets in the nation, quite frankly, in the world. And what those poets taught me was that sometimes in education, like adults need to maybe sit down for a moment, give the students the platform, and I don't even want to say give, provide them the space, right, and a platform and a mic to share what's on their mind,
Mm-hmm.
and then listen to it. And
well, why do you make that distinction between like provide and give?
Well, because I think there's a power thing. Like I'm going to give you this space, right? Versus like this is your space, right? Like education should be a shared experience, and I think too many times it's not a shared experience. I think it's a currency of exchange, right? So there is a hierarchy in the classroom when it comes to classroom management, right? Ultimately, the teacher is the responsible person in the room, but there's a partnership that has to be established. And sometimes, in some instances, I think that partnership and the hierarchy has to be flattened so we can come to a mutual understanding around our search for truth in the classroom. And that my truth might be different from your truth, right? I think, Thich Nhat Hanh and the Buddhist community talk about relative truth versus absolute truth, right? And much of what we think about in our lifetime is relative truth and not absolute truth. So to sit down and listen to someone else's story and someone else's perspective without questioning, without discrediting their experience and their viewpoint, and then applauding that as thank you for sharing that piece of me and that knowledge and that perspective that you have in a very safe environment, was probably the best professional development I ever experienced as an educator.
Do you read a lot of Thich Nhat Hanh?
I do.
That's cool.
I just got done reading The Heart of Buddha. I read Being Peace, Jesus and Buddha as Brothers.
That's awesome.
So I'm not a practicing Buddhist. I'm not a Buddhist, but I love Buddhism and mindfulness, and
that's awesome.
Yeah,
I don't know what it takes to be able to claim the label of Buddhist, but I'm a big fan of mindfulness meditation, and it's totally changed my life. So that's in a really good way. Yeah. So I'm a huge fan.
So one day I think I'm going to be able to connect the Four Noble Truths and the 8 right way path to education, but that's going to take me some time.
I think I mean, one thing that I'm hearing is that like if you're in that if education is a partnership, a relationship with students, I mean, something that I'm hearing is that if you're in a moment where you've become vulnerable as an educator in a classroom, and then a student does call you out, or a student does um, respond in a way that is difficult and would cause you to be defensive, if you have mindfulness, if you have the presence to be there and to listen to it instead of being defensive, that feels like a wonderful application of Buddhism in the classroom.
Yeah, and knowing that, yeah, I hope I don't mispronounce her name. Ijeoma Alua.
That sounds Aluo. Yeah.
She wrote a book called "So You Want to Talk About Race."
Yeah.
And one of the chapters that really stuck out to me is, you're going to screw this up. Yeah. You're going to make mistakes as a white person talking about race.
Yeah.
And when you do so, how to respond to that. Especially if you're dealing with young adults, right? Yeah. So young adults are this roller coaster of emotion and testosterone and estrogen, and as adults, like, what they need is this model. And when adults start doing this,
so for listeners not watching, we're doing like a sinusoidal wave, yes, up and down with hormones, and then just a straight line across for the educator, the adult.
Right. So it's not that we're emotionless, but we keep control of our emotion, and then we're not this like ultra mad or ultra angry, and ultra sad or ultra happy, that we're seeking, right? That we're seeking to understand, and we're looking for perspective, and remaining controlled when you do that.
Yeah. So what I feel like I hear a lot of what you're saying is with kind of these pressing issues in education, with returning, with relationship, with trauma-informed care, with culturally responsive teaching. What I'm hearing you say is there's almost like an awakening or an opportunity that's happened. Like, what is that COVID has sort of made it more clear that we need these things as a higher priority. Mm-hmm. I think before we started recording, you said something like there was a time when they were sort of shiny objects that were accessories, or like what's it called when you have like badges on an apron?
Flair. It's like flair.
Like
flair. Yeah. And it's like, give me some quick tools and some quick techniques that are going to make me more culturally relevant, right? Or culturally prepared. And what I've found is, good teaching is good teaching. But good teaching without keeping the students that you serve in mind is not good teaching, right? It's just teaching. And I mean, there are some culturally responsive techniques out there, but if you don't have the right mindset and how to navigate culture in your classroom, then those techniques are nothing but something that you go through daily, whether it makes you feel better or it maybe pacifies the moment. It doesn't fix the environment, doesn't fix the mindset, and it certainly doesn't establish a stronger relationship between the teacher and the student.
I mean, we're getting spiritual today. If I have not love, I'm just a banging gong or a clashing cymbal. That's what it sounds like you're saying.
Yeah. So, and then I think, there is a focus on pedagogy, right? Like, there are certain moves, man. And, I think that this pandemic took a toll on teachers, man. Like, yeah. And I'm a huge advocate for teachers and what they go through on a daily basis. And I don't think any of us were prepared to go through what we did. Yeah. This last year, for some of our teachers, like our most veteran teachers who we would celebrate, experience, like, I would say, massive amounts of failure
Mm.
within this distance learning environment, right? Like they weren't reaching students like they typically had. And they weren't necessarily equipped in dealing with a student through a computer, right? They couldn't use that physical proximity. They couldn't use what they always done in their career. You know, you teach 36 years and you're a master teacher, and all of a sudden, like you're now forced to teach students who aren't required to engage with you, who aren't required to be seen on this computer screen.
Yeah.
And and I know that Sumner has a pretty amazing student body, as all high schools do, but we certainly don't have the student population that other high schools have. And I know our other high schools. I mean, there were as many as 200, 300 kids who just disappeared.
And the difference is because in KCK, Sumner is a you have to test into it, right? Versus
Correct.
the other
It's a
high
magnet
schools.
school.
So it's a public school, but it's a magnet school. There's a
Correct.
requirement there.
Correct. So even like, and I'll say this, like we have a very highly motivated student population, and we suffered greatly in this pandemic, even with a highly motivated student population.
I hope that those like I hope those kids come back. Like that's the thing that I find like it keeps me up at night. Like just thinking about like, do those students come back? How do they come back? You know, the ones that disappeared, like what an awful experience.
Yeah, and if we think that we can start school like we always have, I think we're fooling ourselves. Which is why I think, for me, the two pressing issues is around trauma informed and culturally responsive teaching are going to be so important. Is we can't just dive into business as usual.
So what's day one like? Like what's the first day of the school year at Sumner going to be like?
I think it's going to be around, well, one, like resetting expectations around what is school, right? And honestly, I feel like if we don't start day one with understanding each other and building relationships, we're starting on the wrong foot. We're going to have to do a lot of rebuilding.
Wow.
I think that our teachers experience a lot of trauma, and I know for a fact that our students experience a lot of trauma, right? And I think we have to provide some space for that, to breathe. That, okay, we're back in, and I'll be honest with you, like even last year, wearing masks and having the social distance, I think we had a little less than 60% of our student population come back to school.
And that was like a month out of the year. That was April to May or something.
April, yeah, it was like early April, maybe late March. I'm forgetting the date, right? And even that like increased the anxiety of educators. And now we've got a full school coming back, not even 60%, right? And I went on vacation this summer to Gatlinburg for the 4th of July. My daughter had dance nationals, and like my anxiety was a little heightened because no one was wearing a mask, and like 80,000 people like converged into Gatlinburg, Tennessee. And I'm one of them going, was this really a smart move for me and my family to just go ahead and immerse ourselves in 80,000 people when the pandemic is not over? You know what I mean? It's subsided, but there's cases that are growing. So I think there's going to be some anxiety for teachers who are returning, for students who are returning. I know that there were a lot of students who chose not to return last year and stay remote, and that's not going to be an option this year, at least in KCK.
There was hybrid learning at the end of last year, but that
right. But you will be required to enroll, and I'm not for sure what contract the district has with students who choose to stay virtual. But I do know that the classroom teacher is not going to be responsible for a virtual environment and a physical environment simultaneously, which is
a huge weight off of teachers.
It is, absolutely. And I think there's a sigh of relief with that.
So day one with students is kind of that focus on relationships and giving credence to that trauma. You're talking about the anxiety that teachers are also experiencing. What's day one with teachers when they come back? before students get there? What's that like?
That's an interesting.
I'm sure you're still figuring that out. Yeah,
we are. And what is the best way? Because we still have a job to do, right? We still have to educate students, and there's still some obligations that we have. We're still beholden to state standards. And I know that's a whole argument in and of itself on the standards-based education movement. But we still have this job to do, right? So how do we bring teachers in, get them excited about this work again, right? Because even as an administrator, man, like I could not wait until that summer hit to where I could just take a breath and say, man, that was a ride. And then 2.5 weeks later, after a short vacation, coming back in, taking a deep breath, going, okay, how do we get ready for this ride? Right. So we have to meet teachers where they are, right? And we have to get them excited about their work. And it's the same thing with students, right? What do they want to get better at? What are their goals and aspirations? What are the things that they want to rebound from? And then we go from there, right?
It's interesting. It hits me that like there's the trauma informed instruction, but then there's also like the trauma informed environment for the educators, for the teachers. Like it's such, like I'm thinking about like if that was your feeling going into the end of the school year, and the feeling of so many other educators and administrators, like that affects you physiologically. That trauma gets stored in your body, like that's tough. Like that's. And then to have only a little bit of a break, in your case, like that's tough.
Yeah, but one of the things that I heard coming back, that really has stuck with me is we're going to have some achievement gaps, right? Like we have some students who really haven't done school for a year and a half, right? And we have some kids who fully engaged but the educational experience shifted, right? And I think that what this pandemic is going to do for us is it's going to highlight those achievement gaps even more, right? Because our teachers experienced it firsthand, right? Like kids not being in the classroom for weeks on end, or sporadic attendance and not turning in assignments. And, the quarterly and semester, we run grade reports, and the amount of students with one or more D's or F's on their grade card was astronomical historically. And so we're going to have these gaps in knowledge and skill. But we can't get into this mindset that our kids are at deficits, right? We can't remediate our way out of this pandemic. We can't start thinking about intervention and remediation before we start talking about that first teach, right? Like when you engage kids and you capture them, and you hold them to high expectations, right? I mean, that's what we want for kids, right? We want to hold them to high expectations. We want them engaged. We want to spark their passion. But you don't do that when you look at a student through a deficit mindset of what this kid doesn't have. We got to figure out what our kids have and use what they have to fill in those gaps of what they don't have. That's going to be an art and a little bit of a science, but it's not impossible. But I think what we have to understand is we have to slow down our work, right? And we have to stop this reliance on the teacher as the central source of knowledge, and the teacher being the facilitator of knowledge, right? Sagata Mitra, I don't know if you're familiar with Sagata Mitra.
Mm-mm.
So he won, I can't remember what year it was, he won the TED Award, won $1 million. He called it the hole in the wall, where he went into India and other third world countries and simply put computers in communities with no teachers, right? And kids were able to very, very quickly navigate themselves into an internet-based world without a teacher, right? So he calls it the school in the cloud. And his central premise is kids can learn without a teacher, but the teacher is an integral part of the learning process, right? So if we can start trusting that kids can learn without us, but that we have the responsibility for setting the conditions for kids to learn, setting up the context and the environments and the situations where kids are able to interact with different forms of text and media, and skill sets in a context that matters. And I think the big argument against standards is, if you look at standards, for the most part, they're skill sets. They're not necessarily content, but where we put those skill sets and what context we put them in matters. If we use those skill sets to prepare for standardized tests, then we're probably doing the wrong thing. If we use those skill sets for them to be able to interact into a society which they're going to be entering, then I think we're doing the right thing. Right? So how do we create environments in our classrooms where kids are doing deep reading, deep writing, deep speaking, deep listening to other perspectives, having some self-awareness, doing some goal setting, knows how to self-regulate when Nathaniel Bozar says something that completely makes me crazy mad, and I know how to respond to you in a way that is thought-provoking and not like daggers of I'm right and you're wrong and I'm going to show you why, right? That's the social emotional learning. That's the trauma-informed instruction, but it's also the culturally responsive teaching. So I think you see, like, we have these labels and these acronyms for all these different things in education, but intersectionality happens all the time, right? Everything's interconnected.
Yeah.
And it's the environments that we create in our classrooms that are going to matter for kids who come back and teachers who come back from a pandemic.
It sounds like what you said there about, was it Sagat Mitra?
Sugata Mitra.
Sugata Mitra, that sort of experiment, or that sort of proof that children can learn independent of the teacher. It almost sounds like another part of the relationship is trust, and that you can almost, the educator can relieve themselves of a little bit of a burden when they trust that their students do have an innate desire to learn, that they have an ability to learn.
Right. I'm reminded he has, and I've used this in PD, professional development with teachers, professional learning. He calls it SOUL, self-organized learning environments. So the premise around that is you create a really robust, engaging question, right? And you allow kids to self-organize. You choose your own groups, right? You choose who you want to work with. If you want to work alone, you work alone. If you want to work with these people, that's fine. And then what he talks about is, like, if you want to change groups, you can change groups. Like, this group's not working for me. I'm going to go to this group and I want to work with this group. And you want to steal information? Like, at what point is information like private? And I'm not going to show you my answers in the real world. Like, in the real world, like, everyone, where are your answers? Like, let's get them on the whiteboard. Let's show it, right? So you're allowed to steal from other people, right? You're allowed to wander to different groups. And the beauty of his work is you're only allowed one technology device, one computer. And you have to collaborate through that. And then you present the answer to the question in your own unique way, right? Is it messy? Absolutely. Does it take time to make it work? Yes. But does it work? Absolutely.
So what did I say that made you really mad?
No, as an example, you did.
Well, in closing, I think that you've kind of done this, but I just, like, something that has come to mind that could be really beautiful is, I wonder if you'd be, a lot of teachers listen to this podcast. So, I mean, what would your word of encouragement to educators going back in after the crazy year and a half that we've had? What would your off the cuff kind of word of encouragement, word of affirmation be?
I would say that one, don't underestimate the power of community and building community and relationships in your classroom. I think first and foremost, I think that's where we need to start, right? Because circumstances vary greatly between family to family, and how this pandemic impacted us, and we have to come to terms with that. Second, I think that you continue to have high expectation of kids. Like, don't lower your expectations because we have students who have missed a year of school, or who are struggling. But I think continue the high expectations, value relationships, and value community. And whatever you do, don't go at it alone. Like, find your thought partners, surround yourself with people not only who think like you, but people who don't think like you. Like, get out of your echo chambers, and challenge yourself and seek different perspectives. But don't go at this alone. And I think that too many teachers went at this alone in this pandemic, and I think they suffered from it greatly because we were isolated, right? Like, if you think about it, as an assistant principal, I could take 2 seconds to walk down the hallway and check on a teacher just to see how they're doing. I just wanted to say hi and how are you and what can I do? That now is a 30-minute process through a phone call, a missed phone call, an email, a Zoom. Everything was it was lengthened, and it took longer. Versus just being physically there and being able to walk up to someone and say, I wanted to see how you are and what I can do for you, right? So the relationships, don't go at it alone, and building community, and then keeping those high expectations for kids. Because I do believe that if you set high expectations and kids trust you and value you and you value them, that they'll meet those expectations.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Wide Ruled. If you like the show, please share it with one friend. Maybe you have someone that's really, into notebooks. And you could say, you know how you like notebooks? Well, there's this podcast that isn't even about notebooks, but it's called Wide Ruled, like a notebook. So you should listen to it. Whatever. You can support the show financially through Patreon at patreon.com/wideruledpodcast. Pledge as little as $1 an episode. If you want to respond to something that Brian and I talked about, or if you have an idea for a future episode or even want to be on the show, email me at wideruledpodcast@gmail.com. Thanks all.